Hello, my name's Dave Emory, and it's my pleasure and privilege to present to this audience once again Dr. Leonard Horowitz, a man who is not only a great citizen, but in my opinion a hero, and also, not incidentally, the author of the vitally important recent book, Emerging Viruses, AIDS and Ebola, Nature, Accident, or Intentional, published in hardcover by Tetra Incorporated, copyright 1996. Len, welcome back to our airwaves.
Great to be back with you, Dave.
Once again, I think that the work that you've done the importance of the work that you've done could not be exaggerated. And I'd like to start by way of explanation with just what is a C-type RNA tumor virus? Because you begin with a discussion of what that is. Could you explain what that is?
Sure. It's a reverse transcriptase. Now, that's a unique enzyme that makes literally life go backwards. Typically in life, the way, I guess, God set it up if you believe in God, or nature set it up if you don't believe in God, that everything is based on the genetic blueprint of life called DNA. And the genetic map is used to develop RNA, which sends messages to the protein manufacturing station of the cell, and it brings in amino acids. It transfers amino acids to that station to then produce new cell parts and then new healthy cells, and that's what typically life does. Now, with this unique reverse transcriptase enzyme in this type C cancer virus, well, what happens is that it calls for life to operate in reverse. It takes this, with the unique enzyme, it takes a single strand of RNA that the cancer virus provides and then calls for the production of a new DNA from the RNA, which then calls for the cell to produce more viruses instead of healthy cell parts. And so this is exactly what researchers at the National Cancer Institute, including Dr. Robert Gallo, in fact, these were the preeminent retrovirus analysts who were evaluating these particular type C cancer viruses in monkeys and in humans, that this is what they were doing in the early 60s at Bionetics, and of course Gallo joined them in the late 60s, and then in the early 70s they had developed, using type C cancer viruses, a whole assortment of AIDS-like viruses. So that's the background on type C cancer viruses.
You mentioned that the AIDS virus it actually goes through a metamorphosis, or a morphogenesis is how you put it, and that it is at a certain point in its existence basically a C-type RNA tumor virus.
That is exactly right. That's based on scientific literature now. They came out with that, researchers came out with that not that long ago. And so when I interviewed Gallo, and when, of course, I challenged him at the 11th International Conference on AIDS, and then he got back to me and gave me his objections to my thesis that he and his workers had developed AIDS-like viruses, and, of course, he denied that allegation. He came out with basically saying it wasn't possible to do that at that time, and, of course, that is absolutely hogwash. In fact, we have his publications that show not only that they were doing this type of research, but they themselves stated that this was extremely risky business. So, and on top of that, I mean, the guy is a complete liar. In fact, the latest news is, Dave, that I am joining forces with several different organizations, and we're currently seeking the wherewithal to bring a fraud suit against Dr. Gallo from more of an independent organization and grassroots initiative.
All righty. Well, just for the sake of legal purposes for this station and others that will carry the program, I'm not in a position to state either myself or on behalf of the station that Dr. Robert Gallo is a liar. That's just simply for legal purposes. Now, back to Robert Gallo.
Yeah, but how do you really feel about that, Dave?
This is for legal purposes, and we're running out of time, Len, because that's actionable, and I cannot make such a statement about Robert Gallo.
Go ahead.
Robert Gallo, however, was doing some very interesting work. As you mentioned, they were basically using genetic engineering techniques to combine parts of monkey viruses with chicken viruses and other types of animal viruses, I believe a cat virus, and then these were adapted to human cell cultures. Could you develop on that for us?
Certainly. Well, this is how Bionetics researchers, as well as Robert Gallo, under National Cancer Institute grant number 712025, it was entitled The Investigation of Viral Carcinogenesis in Primates. That means cancer production through viral infection in monkeys and humans. And the purpose of this grant was to evaluate whether these type C cancer viruses could be modified and be adapted to produce cancers that were traditionally occurring in animals, to be able to produce these in humans as well as monkeys. And that, interestingly enough, one of the many smoking guns in the book, Emerging Viruses, AIDS and Ebola, is that the specific cancer complex tied with immune suppression and immune system dysfunction, that specific one that they spent most of their time and money studying during the largely funded and mostly secret Special Virus Cancer Program, was the leukemia, lymphoma, sarcoma, immune suppression cancer complex that never existed on planet Earth before 1978 with the first cases of AIDS. And you see, when you begin to see that they did exactly what you're saying, they took monkey viruses that they knew would cause cancer in virtually every animal species inoculated into. I'm speaking about SV40, simian virus 40, plus other monkey viruses like the woolly monkey virus. And at the same time, they took human lymphoma viruses that they absolutely knew would cause cancer of the human lymph nodes, and they began to recombine those viruses with elements from the feline leukemia virus, such as the RNA that they knew would cause a whole laundry list of symptoms virtually identical to what AIDS patients are suffering from now. And they also took chicken leukemia, sarcoma virus, RNA, and that would cause wasting, immunosuppression, and death. And that once they had then that mix, they called it a mutant hybrid, if you will, it still had some problems infecting human cells. To get it to jump species easily, they then cultured it and then reported culturing it in human white blood cells in some studies and human fetal tissue cells in culture in other studies so that it would adapt. It would develop then the little unique proteins on the outside membrane of the virus known as GP120-like proteins, which allowed this new type of man-made virus to attach to the human cells, be carried across the human cell membrane, enter the human gene, and then do virtually everything that the AIDS virus does.
You mentioned that that complex, that disease complex, never before seen, emerged in 1978. And before we get to the NCI Special Viral Cancer Research Program and some of the connections to that, in 1969 there was a prediction made in a congressional hearing that a disease like AIDS could be made, and then the program was funded. Could you tell us about that?
Sure. Well, that was the infamous now 1970 Department of Defense appropriations. The hearings were held in 68, after 68, when Henry Kissinger took over as National Security Advisor under Richard Nixon. He almost immediately ordered Melvin Laird to do a reassessment of America's biological weapons capabilities. He was looking for alternatives to nuclear weapons, and when that reassessment came in, he selected therein the option to develop these types of immune system ravaging microorganisms for germ warfare. And then that specific definition of what they were going to be doing was in that document that initiated my 3-year investigation into the origins of AIDS and Ebola that ultimately ended up in the book Emerging Viruses, AIDS and Ebola. The document itself called for, quote, the development of a, quote, new infectious microorganism that could differ in certain important aspects from any known disease-causing microorganism. And most important of these is that it would be refractory to the immunologic and therapeutic processes upon which we depend to maintain our relative freedom from infectious diseases.
Len, define refractory for us.
Well, in essence, what they were looking for, Dave, was a, quote, super germ, end quote. And that word also appeared in the congressional record. A super germ that would not be capable of being treated. It would be able to eliminate the host immune system, leaving people susceptible to the opportunistic infections like tuberculosis, like pneumonia, like candidiasis yeast infections, and like the cancers that we see in AIDS.
Now, you mentioned that we were talking about Dr. Gallo and the work that was being done recombining various animal C-type RNA tumor viruses and then adapting them to human cell cultures. And you mentioned the National Cancer Institute and their special viral cancer research program, if I'm getting the words ordered properly.
Perfect.
That and Fort Det, Maryland. What's the connection?
Well, Fort Det was the testing grounds for the viruses that were being produced outside the National Cancer Institute in independent contractors and outside the military in these organizations like Lytton Bionetics. For example, Lytton was 6th on the list of major Army biological weapons contractors at the time. The director of Lytton Industries, president, was Roy Ash, the counterpart or the other person who was being considered for the Henry Kissinger's role and job as National Security Advisor. His organization was a contractor, much like the New York University Medical Center was a contractor. And, of course, I show you in the book, Emerging Viruses, AIDS and Ebola, the entire list right from the congressional record of all of the top Army biological weapons contractors. Now, they produced these mutant viruses in their labs. They then sent them to various Army biological weapons testing facilities, and Fort Det was the number one. And, of course, it's no accident then in 1972, Nixon turns this over, this entire multi-billion-dollar facility. He sells it at a 10 cents on the dollar to the National Cancer Institute to become the new home of the National Cancer Institute, wherein he says we're no longer going to be developing or testing biological weapons here. And, of course, in small print, they write that they're going to continue to do it for, quote, defensive purposes only. But any fool who knows anything about this knows that if they're going to evaluate defensive, then first they have to produce the germs for offensive. So nothing stopped. After the signing of the Geneva Accord and after the sale of the Fort Det, Maryland biological weapons testing facilities to the National Cancer Institute, nothing changed, as in fact today this biological weapons testing and development continues.
Two corporate overlaps with the NCI and Fort Det and the Special Viral Cancer Research Program. Lytton Industries, which we've already touched on, and Merck. Both companies have a lot to do not only with biotechnology but biological warfare.
Oh, yes, and I think the information that you brought to my attention was extremely critical. When you shared with me the book Martin Bormann, Nazi in Exile, and it goes into detail about how Martin Bormann, upon Hitler's direction, was told to invest the Nazi war chest not only for Germany's reconstruction post-World War II, but literally for the development of a virtual monopoly over the world's pharmaceutical and chemical industries, and this was specifically for the New Ordnung, it was stated in the documents, that is the New World Order, and it was specifically for in other words, the rise of the Fourth Reich, he even told Bormann, and that then Bormann invested the vast majority of the Nazi war chest in 750 corporations, among which Merck was primary. And then you see that at the same exact time, Merck's president, George W. Merck, was made director of America's biological weapons industry, personally appointed by President Roosevelt. And at the same exact time, you remember Henry Kissinger was getting involved in seeking out and finding the Nazis under Project Paperclip to exfiltrate them out of Nazi Germany and ultimately get them to work for the United States intelligence and American medical industry, the medical people, and that Kissinger had been a major and has been a major consultant to Merck Sharp and Dohme, and of course Merck has now developed into the largest pharmaceutical company in the world, and they are principally responsible for the vaccine that most plausibly delivered AIDS to the world, as I concluded in Chapter 13 of the book Emerging Viruses, AIDS and Ebola, and then in the new audio tape that we're coming out with based on our work, Dave. It's a brand new one. It's called The Nazi-American Biomedical Biowarfare Connection, and it traces, subtitle is Rockefeller, Kissinger, Bush, and the Rise of the Fourth Reich. In that tape, we're going to have Maurice Hilleman, the Merck Sharp and Dohme's top vaccine developer and the top vaccine developer for the United States military, on tape, recorded in 1986, admitting that he brought the AIDS virus into North America in contaminated monkeys that were shipped by Lytton Bionetics. So basically, this is the connections, and it's absolutely stunning and horrifying.
We're going to get into Lytton's African operations in just a couple of minutes, but we should perhaps solidify the connection between Lytton Industries, which is also a major defense contractor, and Fort Det and the NCI Special Viral Cancer Research Program, because this is one of the main connections.
Well, you see, Lytton Bionetics ran the entire National Cancer Institute's Fort Det, Maryland facilities. They administered all of the money going through that facility. They administered all the programs. They largely set the agenda for the programs. And they held the contracts, which we reprint. We reprint in black and white the United States contract summary reports in the book Emerging Viruses, AIDS and Ebola, where you see Lytton also held the contracts to supply all the cancer viruses and all the biological weapons contractors throughout the world with all of the monkeys, all the monkey cell lines, all the monkey viral mutant hybrids, so that they could continue to do their cancer and biological weapons research. And so the connection between Lytton, Fort Det, and the National Cancer Institute is like they're the same.
We're talking about the Merck hepatitis B vaccine, and you theorize that may very well have been the vehicle through which AIDS was introduced into the American and perhaps other populations. Now, this was developed by Merck, and a couple of names that figure prominently in this development are the aforementioned Maurice Hilleman and a fellow named Wolf Schmunus.
Right. Well, Wolf Schmunus came in after the 1974. He was actually involved, and in my opinion, he was kind of like a great fall guy. He had connections to the hepatitis B project, but from my research, he didn't really get heavily involved until the actual clinical studies that were ongoing in the late 70s. Now, my research, I go into the early 70s, where it was Saul Krugman from the New York University Medical Center, another documented biological weapons contractor for the Department of Defense, that Saul began to study this hepatitis B in Willowbrook State School mentally retarded children. And between 1965 and 1970, he had inoculated several hundred children with what he felt and his colleagues believed were cancer viruses, hepatitis B. And of course now we have hepatitis C, which we now know is a known cancer virus. And in fact, my theory is that since we began with hepatitis B, it was initially called the Australian antigen, and Krugman and the others started to mutate this and hybridize this and reconstruct it, they began to get the variety of different types of hepatitis virus that we now are hearing much about, like the hepatitis A, C, D, E, and so on and so forth. So basically, we only had initially one, and this was Saul Krugman's project, and then in 1970 he turned the vaccine project against hepatitis B over to Maurice Hilleman, and then as I show you in the book Emerging Viruses, AIDS and Ebola, in 1970-71, Hilleman and researchers at the Centers for Disease Control and the Food and Drug Administration imported contaminated monkeys and chimpanzees from Lytton Bionetics. And of course, this is contrary to what the propaganda is in the book The Hot Zone and The Coming Plague by Laurie Garrett, both of those funded by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, which was intimately connected not only with the Rockefeller-led military medical industrial complex, but also in the cancer industry, and also in the blood industry, and also in the population control industry. And so what happened was that the monkeys came in, the contaminated monkeys came in, and Hilleman began to grow hepatitis B viruses in these contaminated animals. When they had grown enough, they extracted the hepatitis B viruses out of the contaminated animals, and along with it came the assortment of other monkey viruses and herpes-type viruses that are now associated with chronic fatigue, immune dysfunction, and a host of other illnesses. And so they then inoculated this complete gross viral mixture into, again, the children by 1974, the gay men in New York City, and the blacks in Central Africa, Eastern Zaire, and Northwest Uganda, under another contract that I show you. Again, I reprint that contract summary report, again, right in the book, Emerging Viruses, AIDS and Ebola. You see Hilliman's name. You see their name, study title, which was the Research on Oncogenic Viruses and Vaccine Development. That means cancer-causing viruses and vaccine development, and they were using human subjects as well as monkeys, and that then I show you that that was most plausibly the first vaccine that initiated the AIDS epidemic. Why? Because the epidemiology, because of the time. You see, the first isolated strain of an AIDS virus is a 1976 strain, nothing earlier. Contrary to popular belief and hoaxes that have been out in the media, 76 is the earliest strain. So that means you would have had this created prior to 1976. Well, the only thing that makes sense is in 1974, that specific vaccine was developed partly in contaminated chimpanzees supplied by Lytton, and partly in contaminated human beings who had 10 years previously received the heavily contaminated polio vaccine, again containing monkey virus contaminants.
You mentioned, too, that Maurice Hilleman, like so many of the people and institutions we've been touching on, also, in addition to medical research, overlaps research into biological warfare.
Oh, there's no doubt. In fact, Hilleman's research and his history goes way back to the Department of Defense's Research and Development, Department of Science and Research. And you see his involvement as a young man started right around the time of the OSS, when the CIA was just at the end of World War II, beginning to be formed as a cover organization for the German intelligence, a network called the Galen Org and the Merck Net. And it wouldn't surprise me at all if the Merck Net had some relationship to Merck Pharmaceuticals, and that Hilleman began at that time, and of course very soon became the number one, not only Merck Sharp and Dohme's top vaccine developer, but also the top vaccine developer for the United States Army.
One of the things that's interesting, too, is that as the AIDS virus began to spread, and as suspicion began to focus on, among other things, the hepatitis B vaccine program, you mentioned that a Gallo colleague named Poitz did a study which actually served to throw people off the trail. Right.
Well, that's exactly right. The hepatitis B question, whether this vaccine gave rise to the AIDS epidemic, had been brought out by several other researchers who obviously saw the writing on the wall and had seen the incriminating evidence in the research literature, as I had. And so they then put pressure on the CDC to research the question. And then, interestingly enough, anonymous researchers at the Centers for Disease Control, I mean, they didn't even have the guts to put their name on the study. How do you like that? They worked with Poitz and Guerin and people from Abbott Labs and people from Merck Sharp and Dohme to do a study that basically was a bogus scientific study published in the journal Science, which I've seen time and time again. That is a scientific journal that is kind of like a scientific mouthpiece for the Central Intelligence Agency. And in essence, they published a bogus study saying that there was no association between the hepatitis B vaccine and the AIDS epidemic. Meanwhile, the study population that they used, if you look at it, it shows you right away that the study is completely misleading and totally ridiculous, because the huge outbreak of AIDS cases happened in New York City in the gay men, much less so in Denver, much less so in Los Angeles or even San Francisco. Well, these folks, they worked in New York City. They had access to the New York City blood labs. They had access to the gay men in New York City. They had all those records right there, but they refused to look at the New York City population. They looked only at Denver, and they looked only at San Francisco, and then they published that bogus report in Science.
Now, talking about New York City and the blood supply there, as the AIDS epidemic began to develop momentum and as New York City became one of the epicenters for that developing epidemic, an individual was assigned as, I believe, the head of the New York City blood supplier, was it New York City Health Commissioner. And interestingly enough, this fellow David Sensor had previously been associated with the Tuskegee experiment, for which President Clinton recently apologized. Could you tell us briefly, because we got about 2-3 minutes, about Tuskegee, David Sensor, and his position in this inquiry?
Sure. Again, it shows you that the connections between what we are seeing with the AIDS epidemic goes back to military intelligence and public health studies that were genocidal. The Tuskegee study, David Sensor played a key role as the principal director of that study, and then he was handling the public relations on that study when he was at Tuskegee. Then all of a sudden, when gay men were marching in the streets in New York City wanting to get more support for this new gay-related immune dysfunction or deficiency, this was prior to AIDS, it was called GRID, and that they were screaming in New York to please give us something. Well, they sent David Sensor, to become the director of the New York Department of Public Health, and then he was the one who basically did the media education and the responded to the media inquiries, and he was the one then that made the settlements with the gay community, saying that we'll provide you with confidentiality and we'll assure you with confidentiality. So meanwhile, that did nothing but spread the epidemic further. It was not handled in a traditional public health sense. It was handled in a political sense, and he was, again, the principal player in that.
And he'd also been associated with the Tuskegee study.
Exactly.
Perhaps his last name is spelled S-E-N-S-E-R. Perhaps it would have been more appropriate if it was spelled C-E-N-S-O-R under the circumstances.
Right, David Sensor. Yeah.
Len, we're almost through with this particular side. For the benefit of stations that only play a half hour at a time, and there are some, could you give us the address, fax number, etc., and website address for Tetrahedron where people can get a hold of your book and tapes?
Sure, I appreciate that, Dave. The easiest way to get a hold of it is by calling a toll-free number. It's 1-888-508-4787. That's 1-888-508-4787. That's a toll-free number. Also, we have a website. It's www.tetrahedron.org. That's spelled TETRAHEDRON.org, as an organization, O-R-G. And, Dave, we've got a bunch of new materials, too. Besides the book, Emerging Viruses, AIDS and Ebola, we've got the video, which is almost a 3-hour presentation where I go into the vaccine contamination issues and look at critically the question as to whether vaccines are really safe and effective. We've got some audio tapes, including some that we've produced together. One is called Virus Makers of the CIA. It's fabulous. Another one is going to be recently produced, which I told you about earlier. It's the Nazi-American Biomedical Biowarfare Connection. And then we've got another package, because everybody's asking me constantly, what do we do to guard ourselves against these viruses? Well, we've got a new one out called Taking Care of Yourself, and it's a very important work for people.
All righty, and once again, very quickly, because we're almost out of time, the numbers for those. We've got 30 seconds.
Sure. Easy to call, toll-free, 1-888-508-4787. That's 1-888-50-VIRUS.
1-888-50-VIRUS. Very good, Len. We have been speaking with Dr. Leonard Horowitz, the author of Emerging Viruses. For Dr. Leonard Horowitz, this is Dave Emory saying thanks for listening. Hello, my name's Dave Emory, and once again, it's my pleasure and privilege to present to you Dr. Leonard Horowitz, the author of the vitally important recent book, Emerging Viruses, AIDS and Ebola, Nature, Accident, or Intentional. Len, welcome back to our airwaves.
Great to be back with you, Dave.
We've been tracing a vitally important and terrifying chain of events which may very well have resulted in the deliberate creation of some devastating diseases, AIDS and Ebola. We'll talk about Ebola in a few minutes. One of the really scary parts of your research. Well, it's all scary, frankly. But you talk about many of the institutions that were that appear to be implicated in the development of AIDS, and the interest that they were taking in diseases like hepatitis and liver cancer and other types of cancer that occur all around the world, but they were studying them in Africa. Tell us a little more about that, if you would.
Well, what comes up for me immediately is the fact that Africa was the site where they found the lymphoma. In fact, it was Burkitt's lymphoma, where National Cancer Institute researchers, along with International Association for Research in Cancer, that worked with the organization called Lytton Bionetics, where Roy Ash, the president of Lytton, was President Nixon's hand-appointed man for overseeing American industry and had been considered, along with Henry Kissinger, for the National Security Advisor post. Well, at this time in Africa, that was the hotbed for the research that was ongoing in cancer and in vaccinations. And the interesting thing is that we never really had lymphoma spread throughout the world. Burkitt's lymphoma was an isolated, it wasn't even an epidemic, it was considered an endemic disease. And they then took this tumor and then isolated viruses and viral particles out of these tumors and then began to test it on various animal species. And ultimately, I hold basically that the viruses got out in the contaminated vaccines that the same companies were beginning to evaluate and then test.
One of the things that you mentioned, too, is that as this program of medical research is going on in Africa, the Nixon administration and the U.S. national security establishment was extremely interested in population control, or deemed population control to be essential to U.S. foreign policy in the Third World. Could you tell us a little more about that?
Certainly. And the Bush connections to this are striking. You see, George Bush was the first one at the very time that Henry Kissinger took over as National Security Advisor under Richard Nixon and then ordered the development of immune system ravaging microorganisms for germ warfare. George Bush was out in front of Congress for the first time saying that population reduction in the Third World particularly was number one national security priority. And then what you see later on is that George Bush becomes one of the principals in the diamond industry of Africa. And, of course, the African continent was a jewel. In fact, not only did, according to Nixon, it contain 1/3 of the world's uranium, but also Zaire, Angola region was a primary area for copper and other minerals. And, in fact, at the same exact time, Kissinger then, as we began to pull our troops out of Vietnam, made this area, that is Central Africa, Zaire, Angola, the number one next stand, the greatest stand against world communism. And he sent CIA troops into this area. He set up Mobutu. They paid Mobutu millions and millions of dollars to allow CIA agents to operate from Zaire, and began to bring in NATO alliance corporations. And, of course, the German connection and the Nazi connection to this are very, very clear. And so this is the hotbed. It's no accident, in my opinion, that this now becomes the ground zero for both the AIDS as well as Ebola outbreaks.
And we're going to talk about Mobutu, we're going to talk about Outrag and some other things in just a couple of minutes. We spoke about George Bush. I would add that there is an article in Covert Action issue number 41 by Anthony Kimmery, which makes a very good case, albeit circumstantial, that George Bush has in all probability been involved with the CIA since the time that he graduated from Yale. Now, specifically, Len, with regard to population control, could you develop a little bit further for us what it was that was deemed to be important to U.S. foreign policy about controlling populations in the Third World, Africa in particular?
Well, it's populations that are the principal barrier to foreign governments coming in and also corporations coming in and taking over. I mean, the military imbalances or security issues are contingent upon the level and knowledge as well as armaments within the populations. So it is not surprising that now in Africa, particularly in this area of Africa, you have villages that are wiped out. You have, as a matter of fact, I received a letter today from an African physician saying how devastating the AIDS epidemic has been to this area of Africa, and that you have in many places a 55-60% depopulation. And so also when that happens, the psychological effects of that type of thing, imagine in this country how shell-shocked people would be if every second person were dead. So by that time, you feel like basically people can be completely manipulated. They're walking around like zombies. And of course, I've literally met CIA agents who've informed me that it would have been easy to eradicate some of the other epidemics, like the intestinal bugs that were going around and the dysenteries. It would have been very, very simple for them to have eliminated those types of problems. But you see, as disease breaks out and people begin to leave certain areas, of course, the journeys are additionally stressful. That further weakens the immune systems. They then get additionally susceptible to infectious diseases. And this is the genocide that is literally going on in Africa today.
A couple of points in passing. In addition to some of the minerals that you mentioned, Africa is also very rich in minerals which are deemed essential for the aerospace industry, such as titanium, which is used to alloy some of the high-stress metals that are used. Also, I would note that the IARC that you mentioned, the International Association for Research into Cancer, is an association that is comprised of the top NATO countries. One of the things you point out, too, Len, is that a vaccination program or vaccination programs were undertaken in Africa by the United States in cooperation with other countries under the auspices of the Agency for International Development, a frequent cover for U.S. intelligence operations.
That's absolutely correct, USAID. And in fact, in the book Emerging Viruses, AIDS and Ebola, I show you direct government documents showing exactly how much U.S. taxpayer money went through USAID to fund the various population control, family planning, maternal and child health. Of course, after it became politically incorrect to call it population control, they then began to call it maternal and child health and or family planning. And of course, again, I show you the background history of this is the Rockefeller-led Population Control Council of the City of New York, which gave rise to all the other population control councils, which then set the scientific and medical agendas, whereby now we have family planning and maternal and child health. And this was extremely active. In fact, Africa was one of the principal areas where most of the money and activity was being spent.
One of the things that you talk about, too, is that Africa was the area where the HIV-2 was first discovered, and that's an organism that has a very interesting history.
Well, that is. Again, when you look with any level of common sense at the scientific facts, you can't but conclude that this is a vaccine-induced epidemic. And specifically, this virus, HIV-2, which is more benign than the HIV-1 AIDS virus is, was discovered by a Max Essex, who is Dr. Robert Gallo's counterpart at the Harvard AIDS Institute, which is my alma mater. Basically, Max Essex, 2 years ago at the National AIDS Update meeting, I asked Max Essex why it was that, how he discovered this in Senegalese female prostitutes, and then number two is how, other than through contaminated vaccines, could it have been delivered to Senegalese female prostitutes? And the question became important because of this. This HIV-2, it was determined, was a monkey virus that did not exist, and still to this day does not exist in wild monkeys. Only laboratory-contained monkeys. So how was it, other than through vaccines, that a monkey virus laboratory contaminant could end up in Senegalese women, female prostitutes, who typically get the hepatitis B vaccine because hepatitis B is a sexually transmitted disease, and those prostitutes there are legal, and the state looks after them, they're involved in public health, and they get vaccinated with hepatitis B vaccine. So I asked Essex, and he wouldn't answer.
Excuse me, go ahead.
He wouldn't answer, and then I basically pressed him on it, so ultimately he came out with something that was kind of juicy, and it'll give you an indication of the level of disgusting, sloppy science that even exists today in the world's leading AIDS research labs. He said, well, I can tell you, in defense, he said, I can tell you how my monkeys got contaminated. I said, fine, why don't you tell me that? He says, my monkeys got contaminated because they were shipped to us from monkey suppliers who had received them back from other researchers who had inoculated them with human tissues while they were studying other illnesses.
It sounds to my admittedly medically and scientifically untrained ears like that's sort of like putting the cart before the horse.
Well, to me, it indicates that this is the level of sloppy science. Here, this man, one of the world's leading AIDS researchers, says he discovers a HIV-2, a new strain of the AIDS virus, in women, and then it turns out that it's a monkey virus laboratory contaminant.
One of the things you point out, too, about some of the studies that were going on in Africa with regard to cancers, hepatitis B, etc., one of the chilling elements of that was that the applicability, or I'm not sure what the scientific term would be, but that the susceptibility of African populations in other parts of the world, including, for example, New York City, to the same types of diseases that were being studied in Africa was determined to be continuous.
Yeah, it was actually, it's fascinating, the connections between Africa and America. And Dave, tell me more specifically, what would you like to know about that?
Well, in studying the susceptibility of certain African population groups to cancer, it was found that American African populations, specifically blacks in New York City, would have the same type of susceptibility. In other words, these are studies that are very reminiscent of the seroepidemiologic studies that the Nazis did during World War II in the concentration camps.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And, again, interestingly enough, recently at that same meeting, Max Essex came out and said that the reason why blacks are particularly susceptible to infection with AIDS, and then more recently we found a gene, or the researchers found a gene allegedly that would allow blacks to be specifically susceptible to Ebola virus infection. I mean, all of this reeks of the eugenics agenda, which again was funded by the Rockefellers initially in the 1920s, which gave rise to Hitler's eugenic agenda, and that the extermination of Jews and gypsies and blacks and gay people and Christians during World War II. And again, if you look at the populations of the world today that are grossly under attack, essentially the only thing that's missing is the Jews. And a lot of folks are saying, well, this is a Jewish conspiracy, and I hate to differ with you. It's not a Jewish conspiracy. Next time it will basically be Jews will be targeted again.
Oh. It was fascinating because as we speak on August 27th, 1997, just a couple of days ago in the papers, there was a story about the susceptibility of Ashkenazi Jews, I believe it was, to a certain type of colon cancer, the genetic susceptibility.
Yes, exactly. And again, you have the susceptibility of Jewish men of European descent to sarcoma, which again was very benign. It was found in some African people as a benign, non-invasive tumor, and all of a sudden, after they began to experiment with that type of virus, and they began to mutate it and get it to become more lethal, they then found, allegedly genes associated with sarcoma cancer development in Jewish men of European descent. I mean, all of this is absolutely, it smacks of genocide, and the only difference between what happened during Hitler's time and right now is that they've had additional 40 years to expand their biotechnologies and their counterintelligence propaganda.
Yes, and we should bear in mind also the connection we mentioned earlier, where Merck, a giant German pharmaceutical company, was one of the recipients of some of the Borman flight capital. Talking about Africa and some of the roles played by some of these institutions in Africa, we talked about Lytton Bionetics and Lytton Industries in connection with the National Cancer Institute and Fort Det. You mentioned a fascinating connection between Lytton and monkeys bound for research laboratories around the world.
Well, again, Lytton held a contract. And, again, Richard Preston, for example, in his book, The Hot Zone, which was on the New York Times bestseller list for a couple years and still gets a lot of play. You know, he says that the monkeys that were associated with the Ebola-like outbreak in Washington, D.C. at Hazelton Labs was from the Philippines. But yet when you really look at the research literature, these monkeys, particularly C. aethiops, the African green monkeys, came from Central Africa. And according to the National Cancer Institute research publications, this was the contract that was held by Lytton. And the biohazard and containment in these labs was overseen by Dow Chemical. And interesting, you see that these are the people that you can't trust, worth anything. These are the people who allowed 450,000 women to get the silicone implants that leaked and caused immune dysfunction and, of course, depopulation of the women. And you've got this organization shipping now contaminated monkeys around the globe. It's just, again, the game is up. I mean, the documented evidence in the book Emerging Viruses, AIDS and Ebola, including the contracts and including the most incriminating government documents, where you see in black and white that authors like Richard Preston, books like The Hot Zone, books like The Coming Plague are counterintelligence propaganda that have successfully lulled Americans to sleep in a false sense of fear, the fear that these viruses are spontaneously mutating in bottom of caves in Africa, or as population explodes there, they allege, again, kill two birds with one stone, let people know how terrible the overpopulation problem is, and then tie it to, the presence of the plagues, the thesis that these bugs are coming out of the forests of Africa as population explodes and we cut down the African rainforest, and this is God's wrath against human beings for overpopulating. I mean, this is such garbage. It is an insult to anyone's level of intelligence, if anyone is intelligent enough to look at the evidence.
Len, we were talking about the Lytton monopoly on all monkeys going to research laboratories out of Africa, and specifically it was a Ugandan facility, was it not?
That's right. In fact, it's hard to find that in the research literature, Dave. There's only a couple research papers that state that Lytton was associated with the monkey colonies in southeast Uganda. And, of course, I found that their laboratories were in association, their research labs were in association with the International Association for Research Cancer in northwest Uganda, which was just a couple hundred miles from that cave that Richard Preston alleged that the Ebola virus broke out of.
This is our next topic of discussion. Now, you mentioned that the Ebola virus was virtually identical to the Marburg virus and that it was first detected in laboratories. Tell us about that.
Well, again, the mother of Ebola, I'll give you the history of the Ebola virus according to the scientific literature, not according to the historic revisionism and the new science that is garbage, bogus, disinformation. You see, the first Ebola virus broke out in Sudan and northern Zaire, southern Sudan and northern Zaire. It was called Ebola Zaire, Ebola Sudan. And actually, the mother of that virus broke out a few years earlier, in 1967, in 3 vaccine production laboratories, all in Europe. That is in Belgrade, Yugoslavia, Frankfurt, Germany, and Marburg, where it got its name. Now, I show you in the book Emerging Viruses, AIDS and Ebola, the specific study in a U.S. government document printed by John Landon, the director of Lytton Bionetics Research Labs, where Landon took what was called rhabdovirus simian. It was a rabies type of virus. Of course, rabies runs in rodents. Now they begin to take this rodent virus and they begin to inoculate it into monkeys to get it to jump species into the monkeys and study it. And he took that rhabdovirus simian, he inoculated it into 18 monkeys. 9 of them died. The other 9 were transferred. And you remember the movie Outbreak?
I didn't see it, but I'm aware of it.
Okay, well, at the end of the movie Outbreak, people who saw it remember that there was a monkey that was infected with the Ebola-like virus that they had to find. It was in the woods, and they finally found it, and Dustin Hoffman flies this monkey to the vaccine production labs. We're in Hollywood ending. Within 48 hours, they develop a vaccine to save the United States. Well, that's what they did with the monkeys that were living with the viruses that survived the infection. They had developed antibodies, and they sent those monkeys to the vaccine production labs wherein the Marburg virus first broke out. And so, truly, the most plausible, in fact, the top experts in virology, in monkey virus and cancer science, at that time, 1967, 68, 69, stated in their symposiums that the Marburg virus, the mother of Ebola, was man-made.
Now, you mentioned the outbreak of Ebola, and you told one of those major outbreaks was in Zaire. Recently, there was a fair amount of journalistic space garnered by the fall of Mobutu Sese Seko, a previously sponsored American despot in Zaire. And you talk about Zaire, you talk about Mobutu Sese Seko, and the timing of the Ebola outbreak there.
Well, it was very close to a critical time in Central African history, particularly in Zaire's history. Mobutu, after accepting hundreds of millions of dollars, and this is one of the world's wealthiest people, because he played the Cold War forces against each other very successfully. Now, after accepting millions upon millions of dollars from the NATO alliance countries and setting up a whole assortment of corporations from these countries, as these countries came in to invest in Zaire, well, all of a sudden he says, we're going to nationalize your companies. We're going to take over these multi-million-dollar operations that you've invested your money into, and we're going to nationalize it. It's going to be ours. And he says, moreover, if you don't like that, well, forget you, West. We're going to go talk to the East. We're going to work with Cuba. We're going to work with China. We're going to work with Russia. And, you know, we're not going to be interested in you. Well, it was within months of this decision that the Ebola virus broke out in his northern part of the country. And then, of course, the evidence in Richard Preston's book, The Hot Zone, of course, that's accurate, consistent with counterintelligence propaganda. You have to add 80% truth, otherwise it becomes an absolute fraud, and you can see right through it. So it was true. The Centers for Disease Control were called in. It was a military operation. They cordoned off this whole area, the Ebola Valley of northern Africa, and it was, of course, within weeks of this that Mobutu suddenly changed his mind and then began to invite Henry Kissinger back to Zaire to negotiate additional treaties with them. And, of course, one of those treaties that followed not so long after this was the OTRAG Treaty.
That was our next topic of discussion. Mention OTRAG. Tell us about OTRAG.
Well, OTRAG is a Nazi-linked organization whose president, Kurt DeBus, was sent by Henry Kissinger and American intelligence as he was initially brought over. He was one of the Hitler's V-2 missile project directors. He came over during Project Paperclip. He was paid over, like the other researchers, over $65,000 a year to work for the United States. He became top at American Aerospace, consultant to Boeing, consultant to NASA, and he became in the 60s the director of Cape Canaveral. Cape Canaveral in Florida. Now, in 1972-73, they pull him from that position at top man at Cape Canaveral. They send him to Zaire, where he and his colleagues are principals in a German Nazi-linked organization called OTRAG, O-T-R-A-G. And they lease from Mobutu 28,000 square miles of eastern Zaire, containing 760,000 African villagers, to do whatever they wanted with the property or the people. and this was completely their area, and apparently the lease is still ongoing to the year 2000, I understand.
And you speculate that based on some literature which came out during the Cold War, that actually it was the Soviets who brought out information. This during a time, however, when the Soviets were moving toward rapprochement with the West under Gorbachev, and when the Soviets were about to cease to become Soviets, that one of the things that was being researched at OTRAG was immune-destroying viruses.
That's exactly right. In fact, again, like in the book Emerging Viruses, AIDS and Ebola, I show you at this specific time, there was no reason. In fact, there was a counter-incentive for the Soviets to blame America for being associated with OTRAG and the development of the AIDS virus. But in essence, when I began to research whether the Russian report was accurate, I found it extraordinarily so. In fact, I found major connections between OTRAG, or at least major circumstantial connections between OTRAG and Litton Industries, because Litton was a major supplier of the satellite technology, the missile guidance systems, a lot of the computers, as well as a lot of the medical equipment that was being used in that area at that time. And of course, this was all done in association with NATO, and this was very, very, very much what OTRAG was involved in.
You mentioned Project Paperclip. Another person you mentioned in connection with that in emerging viruses is Erich Traub.
Yes, another Nazi, Hitler's top biological weapons developer, who was brought to work for the United States Navy Biological Research Laboratory, and they began to affiliate in the 1960s with the University of California at Berkeley and Irvine, and also with the Naval Biological Research Labs in Norfolk, Virginia. And, of course, the California Department, which became one of the United States' principal academic biological weapons development and testing departments, is where Dr. Peter Duesberg, the fellow who claims that HIV has nothing to do with AIDS, with a heavy, thick German accent, comes from.
And you mentioned that Peter Duesberg, and we're very low on time, Peter Duesberg was actually involved with Robert Gallo in some of these same cRNA-type tumor virus projects.
Exactly. They were intimately connected in the Special Virus Cancer Program. What Gallo was doing in monkeys, Duesberg was doing the exact same thing in chickens, and they were comparing notes constantly.
Len, in just a few seconds, if you can, the Kikwit outbreak of Ebola was something you not only predicted, but it turned out to be a very strange virus.
Well, that's it exactly. I mean, again, the question becomes, since the Ebola Kikwit, which was in just 1995, April 1995, I had predicted it, not only that, but when they finally did the DNA analysis on this new virus outbreak in southern Zaire, they found it to be virtually identical in DNA sequence to Ebola Sudan and Ebola Zaire. Now, my question to everybody is, what do you need to have in order to have a virus that mutates very rapidly? If it jumps from one animal or one human to the next, it's already 5% different. As they're highly unstable because these are man-made viruses. They haven't had centuries of time on planet Earth to stabilize into a form that could be mutually beneficial to the host as well as to the virus itself. So what do you need to have in order to have a virus that mutates extremely rapidly, travel over 20 years, 1,000 kilometers, and come out virtually identical? There's only one answer, Dave. You know it. It
was in a laboratory.
Exactly. You need a refrigerator.
And basically, this is not something that could have occurred in nature. Len, we're virtually out of time. Very quickly, the 800 number.
The 800 number to get the book, it's actually a toll-free 888 number, 1-888-508-4787. That's 1-888-508-4787.
And that for information about getting emerging viruses and the various tapes available from Tetrahedron. We've been talking with Dr. Leonard Horowitz. For Leonard Horowitz, this is Dave Emory saying thanks for listening.